Hello and welcome to the Astranti pre-scene analysis for the August 2018 operational case study exam, and the company we have to look at here is Thomas Fine Tees. So my name is James and I'll be guiding you through this operational case study pre-scene analysis. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself before we get into it. So I'm the head of case studies at Astranti. I oversee the OCS, MCS and SCS at Astranti, but primarily I am the person that produces the OCS pre-scene analysis, the top 10 issues and the strategic analysis, and I'm also involved in writing the mocks and marking the OCS mocks as well. So I'm very much involved in the operational case study, and I have been for several years now. I know it quite well. I know what the exam contains, what to expect, how to prepare for the exam, and the kind of things that CIMA deliberately put in the pre-scene to set themselves up for exam questions later on. So in addition to being a mock writer and a marker, generally I'm a tutor at Astranti as well. I record and produce tuition videos. I help to write mock exams, not only for case study materials, but also for individual papers such as F1, F2, F3. I've also been part of the production of our study texts, free study texts available at astranti.com. I am on Facebook. If you search for James Nutting Astranti, you'll find my page where I'll be posting plenty of things to do with the operational case study as we lead up to the exams. So this video series has a few different elements. So primarily in this first section, we'll be looking at the pre-scene, and we'll be looking at the pre-scene essentially section by section, page by page, looking at it and analyzing it. And what we're going to be looking for are the key points. What can we draw out of the pre-scene that are key issues? And to do this, we'll be using some models such as a SWOT analysis and pedestal to help us identify key areas of concern for the company, things to keep in mind going into the exam. We're also going to be taking a look at the wider industry in which the company is a part of, and how that relates to the company, how that informs what they're doing, their position within that industry, obviously limits or sort of predetermines the options available to them within that industry. Relevant business models that come up. So I've already mentioned SWOT and pedestal. They're going to be useful in doing general analysis of the company, but there might be other models that we might bring in that actually are more relevant to specific exam questions. And that brings us on to the likely exam issues. So as I'm going through the pre-scene analysis, any issues that I see that I know come up regularly, they've come up in the past, or that they don't come up at all, I'll be taking note of that and sort of preparing you for the exam by telling you what is likely to come up, what is likely to not come up. In addition to that, I'll just be giving you some general hints and tips on exam strategy, how to approach the exam and managing your time, and the kind of things to do in questions and planning, and the best way to get good answers that ultimately lead you to passing your exam, hopefully the first time round. Once we've done the pre-scene analysis, and the pre-scene analysis, that is the first 6 videos where we're strictly looking at the pre-scene in depth. You have those 6 videos, and then the next video is the strategic analysis. That's a separate video where we take the rational planning model, which is not actually examinable at operational level, but don't worry about that. It's just a tool we are using to analyze the company and essentially come up with a strategy so that when you go into the exam, you can present ideas and discuss issues that are in alignment with the overall strategy of the company and not things that are completely off track in a strategic sense. We also have the top 10 issues video, and that is pretty much what it sounds like. It is the top 10 issues that I've identified in the exam that are likely to come up, and that'll be 10 key areas, and we'll break those down into depth and give you advice on how to prepare for that particular area, what models are relevant, why it might come up, how often it comes up, those kind of things. So that gives you an overview there of the entire video series available for this sitting. how is it going to work? What should you expect from the video series? Well, as we've said, I'll be going through the pre-scene section by section. And as I go through, I'm not going to assume any prior knowledge as I progress. As I go through this, I'm learning things for the first time, just as you are. I haven't skimmed through the whole thing. I haven't looked ahead. So I'm discussing things. We're kind of bringing you through this together, and I'll be hopefully imparting some of my knowledge to you. But as we go through, it would be good if you are reading this section yourself and making notes. So for example, as we continue with this first video, if you would like to say, read the first 2 or 3 pages, make your own notes, and then come back and watch this video and see what I have to add, what kind of analysis I did that you missed out. And perhaps you might have even got things that I missed too. And if you do that, then feel free to comment or get in touch and get involved on our forums. And as I said, you do your notes, make your section of the section, come back to the video and you compare it and see what we go over in my review. And at the end, as I've said, the separate video of the strategic analysis, that's a full strategic analysis. That video itself is usually at least an hour long, and the same again for the top 10 issues. Notes on the pre-scene. So the aim of the pre-scene, and this is an important thing to keep in mind as we go through, think of the pre-scene. Obviously, CIMA have made the pre-scene, and CIMA are the ones writing the exam, and they have their own kind of agenda and the syllabus that they have to test you on. So the pre-scene for them is their opportunity to give you the context for the business so that they can later take that context and give you issues and scenarios. So from your perspective, you can think of it, if you read between the lines and think, okay, CIMA have included this information. Why have they included that? They wouldn't have included it if they didn't need to. So if you think of that as we go through, that will help you when it comes to the exam itself. It's not a good idea to pre-write anything based solely on the pre-scene. So this analysis will be good to give you context. You'll have really good, deep understanding of the company and the industry by the time you're done with this. But the goal or the point of the exam is to deal with issues as they are presented to you. So you shouldn't go into the exam thinking, well, I've basically written out all my answers already. I did the SWOT and I did the pestle. So if anything like that comes up, no, wrong. Don't do that. You can use those models, for example, to give you the context and to be prepared. But if something comes up in the unseen, then, this is to give you the background to deal with unseen issues, not to write your answer before you go in there. So make sure you don't make that mistake. That is not to say that you shouldn't use this on the day of the exam. So this analysis is going to be essential in you getting good marks in your exam. Like I said, it gives you the context, it gives you the background, and you should use it on your exam. But you shouldn't only use that, and you shouldn't think all the work has been done now. You do still have stuff to do on the exam day. And particularly with the strategic analysis, you can make recommendations in the exam that are consistent with our analysis. So going through the pre-scene, the themes that we see come up, the issues that we see come up, the main key points that come up, you can make recommendations that are consistent with that. And that will look good. That will get you good marks. It will show the examiner that you know what you're talking about and you've taken the time to learn about the company. Okay, and with that, let's get back to the pre-scene analysis. So before we just jump into the actual analysis itself, I want to go through the rough structure of the video series. So these first 6 videos in the pre-scene analysis, just so you know which video is covering which content, I'm going to run through roughly what video is going to be covering which part of the content now. So in this first video, in video 1, we'll be going through the introduction, your role, and the first page or so of the extracts from the induction manual up to, say, about page 5, and that'll do it for video 1. And then from there, we'll just continue on. So video 2 will be picking up from there around about page 5 and moving through these sections through to other products. And then in video 3, we're moving on to the production process. And that's pages 10 to 13, and we look a bit at the customer's as well there. And then in video 4, we have to kind of split it a little bit. So we'll be looking at the organizational chart and the directors, so a bit about the structure of the company. But also included in video 4, we're going to skip ahead and take a look at this information on the industry section. So the pages 24 to 25, we're going to include those in video 4. Then in video 5, we're looking at the financial statements and the budget information, often quite an interesting video, particularly for those of you who love looking at the numbers. And then finally, we'll finish with video 6, where we'll be looking at a number of press articles included in the end of the pre-scene, and then we'll go through the tax regime and point out any salient information that's included there. So there's a structure of what you can expect, and if you need to refer back to this first video to find out exactly what video you can go to find relevant information, or additionally you can use the pre-scene, the annotated pre-scene that I'm annotating here will be available to you as well if you look on our website and find that, and you can use that to find out which video you need to look at for which part of the pre-scene. Okay, so that's enough introductory stuff. Let's actually get into it, and though it is ironically titled Introduction, we'll finally get to do some analysis looking at the company. So the name of the company then, as we've already seen, is Thomas Fine Teas, and that gives us a clue that they are a tea company, but we'll learn more about that in a moment. And they are a company based in D-Land, the fictional company. It's always a fictional company with the case studies. It's loosely based on usually a EU company or an amalgam of different EU companies. So we don't need to worry too much about that. But it's useful to have an idea of what kind of country it is that the company is based in. So we can look to a similar country in real life and see what kind of political environment that might be that they're in, what kind of regulations they'll have to abide by, the sort of economic sort of outlook and policy of the company. Obviously, if it's a sort of EU country, it's going to be significantly different to sort of Eastern Asian company or an African country, somewhere like that. And like I say, in most cases, it's going to be a European country, an EU sort of company. In this case, we learned that D-Land has a population of around 35 million. So doing a quick Google search, European countries with a population of 35 million, the one that is closest to that is in fact Poland. Now, I'm not convinced that we're supposed to think that this country or this country D-Land is supposed to be anything like Poland. Obviously, the history of Poland is quite complex, and they will have had sort of monarchy and democracy, and they were also former they sort of had a terrible time during World War II, and they were part of the Soviet Union, and so there's a complicated economic history there, and I'm not sure that we're supposed to take that from it. And we learn here that D-Land has a lengthy coastline with developed ports and borders several other countries. So I think it's, even though the population is it probably isn't too important, and we're probably thinking more of a Western European country here, like the United Kingdom or the Netherlands or Germany or somewhere like that. That's probably the best thing to think of. And I think it's important not to dismiss some of this information. So we're told that they have a lengthy coastline with developed ports, and they border several other countries. So that puts them in a good position to engage in international trade, doesn't it? Because if you've got developed ports, then there's a good chance that historically you've used that, the countries use that to their advantage to trade with other countries, much like Britain and at the time the Netherlands with the sort of Dutch East India Company and all those kind of things. So having developed ports bordering several other countries, again, that means you're immediately accessible to different countries in your area, and different countries may provide different services that can take advantage of. And so these are all going to be integral parts that inform the political and economic environment of D-Land, and this is the country in which Thomas Fine Teas are operating. So that's all important information. It's important background information for us to sort of keep in mind as we go through. And one final thing is that the currency is the D dollar. Now, there's no information given on any exchange rates or anything like that, so we can assume it's somewhere between the dollar, the pound, and the euro in terms of its value, but it sort of doesn't really matter that much. Okay, so Thomas Fine Teas imports tea leaves from around the world. Okay, so immediately this information before about the lengthy coastline with developed ports bordering several other countries, suddenly that is much more important because this company, one of their primary activities is importing tea leaves from around the world. And in order to do that, you're going to need the infrastructure in your own country to be able to do so. If you're a remote island in the middle of the Pacific Island, it's going to be a hell of a lot more difficult for you to import tea from around the world if you don't have that sort of infrastructure there. And obviously this country, this fictional D-land, has that historical trade, sort of history of trade where they have developed ports, and that's going to make something like a tea company much more likely to succeed in a country like this than anywhere else. The other thing here is, of course, if they're importing tea leaves from around the world, that immediately opens them up to exchange risk. And you've got a company here who are importing products from all around the world. That means they're going to be dealing with payments and invoices in all kinds of different invoices. That exposes them to changes in exchange rates between those different currencies. And so that's going to be a sort of a salient risk for this company, something that they're going to have to manage. And that would be something that comes up in any kind of PESTEL analysis. Of course, PESTEL analysis is a key analysis tool for examining the external environment in which a company operates. And the PESTEL is an acronym for political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. So the economic aspect of that is going to be the kind of exchange rate risk that they're exposed to from being an internationally active company. Okay, so relating that back to the syllabus, of course, that's the important thing to do. So you can go away from this video and review any topics that you need to for this exam. Imports, so the exchange risk element, that's of course going to be relevant for the risk sort of element of the P1 paper. And also in F1, it's a small part, but there is a part in F1 where we learn about this sort of accounting for gains and loss on exchange, particularly with activity with foreign entities. So that's going to be a part of F1 that is more than likely going to be relevant come the exam in August. Right, so the company then, they import tea leaves from around the world, so they're not actually growing the tea leaves themselves or managing that side of things. They're importing tea leaves that are presumably already been grown and picked and packaged. And then once they've imported those tea leaves, they create their own distinctive blends. Okay, so they're in charge of getting the right tea leaves from all the different countries, all the different places, and creating a distinctive blend. And then with that blend, they produce their own tea bags for sale, and their main customers are supermarkets and wholesalers, so it's business to business. And in addition to tea bags, they make herb-based infusions, which are sort of very similar to the concept of a tea bag, but instead of containing any tea leaves, it's just different kinds of herbs. And they're more and more popular today, and they get going more popular over time. So just looking at this paragraph then, they're producing their own tea bags, so we know that there's going to be an element of production involved, and they're likely to be they have their blender and they'll have their process of how they pick their different teas and blend them together. And so an important element of that is going to be managing their stock and inventory and getting the right amounts of different teas that they need to make their blends, and then putting that through the process to make the finished products. And then it looks like they only produce tea bags and not loose leaves, so they're going to have some ability to produce tea bags and buy in the raw materials to baking those bags out of paper or whatever natural fibers tea bags are made of. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. And then they're going to need their sort of marketing and sales department to look at making sort of contracts and selling to supermarkets and wholesalers. And they're going to be doing that with their herb-based infusions as well. So that's kind of roughly the overall operating responsibilities of this company. So for me, as far as I can tell, the key areas then are going to be procurement. So making sure they're getting either the best quality products they need, or the most sort of the cheapest, not the cheapest, but if they're either going for quality or they're going for sort of bulk manufacturing, in which case it's more about the price. The design is going to be important because they've got to establish themselves in the market as different from other tea manufacturers, and so getting the right blend, getting the right flavor of your tea bag, that's going to be essential to keeping your customers and to getting new ones. Obviously, manufacturing is important because the efficiency of the process here is going to have a large impact on how profitable the company can be, depending on their approach, whether they're a premium producer or a sort of a more lower end part of the market. And their sales and marketing is primarily going to be to supermarkets and wholesalers, but of course they need to advertise to the end consumer as well. So an important part of that for them will be, again, making their tea stand out from the other competitors to the end consumer, so that when they go to the supermarket, they want to buy Thomas Fine Teas over someone else, and thus the supermarkets get more of their stock in. Okay. So the next paragraph then, Thomas Fine Teas was established just over 200 years ago, which makes it quite an old business. Now, if you look at the history of the tea business, particularly tea companies and tea manufacturers in the United Kingdom and places like that, and in Ireland, then 200 years is sort of medium length, towards the sort of older of the established tea manufacturers. Obviously, tea drinking and tea making goes back a long way, but it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, around about 200, 250, 300 years ago in Britain, where companies really turned making tea into this commercial viable business. And so 200 years is a sort of reasonably sort of well established, but certainly there are newer companies that have been around and invented in the last 50 years in Britain. But 200 years, although it sounds very old, it's about average for a company that is making tea. Okay, and actually looking round at the different dates of establishment of different tea manufacturers in Britain, there are sort of a list of the ones that are most likely to be the real-life companies that Thomas Fine Teas are based on. Having looked through them, I think the closest real-life comparison is the tea company Twinings. But more than likely, because it's a fictional company, it's going to be based on different elements of different sort of tea manufacturers and tea makers. So they're, in the UK at least, the top sort of 5 companies for tea bags are as follows. And bear in mind, this is sort of by sales, by sort of market share, by revenue. And so number 1 is Tetley's. That's the most popular in the UK, followed by PG Tips. And those are really sort of the biggest two, Tetley's and PG Tips. They sort of, although this is a top 5, this is kind of dominated by 1 and 2. And in third place, you've got Typhoo. And then Twinings comes in at 4th, with Yorkshire Tea down at 5th. So again, I think a company like this, Thomas Fine Teas, they're probably not going to be as big as the sort of Tetley's or PG Tips. They're probably more likely to be somewhere between Twinings, Yorkshire Tea, or Typhoo. It's that kind of slightly smaller, maybe slightly more high-end, more premium, more expensive teas that are more for, those with an acquired taste who like a higher quality tea rather than the sort of mass-produced, most popular Tetley's and PG Tips. Right, so where were we? The company was established just over 200 years ago, by Joseph Thomas, and Joseph was originally involved in shipping, and due to his access to tea cargoes, developed a liking for tea and developed an ability to taste the difference between tea leaves from different regions. So we've got a company then that started off by a bit of an expert, potentially maybe a bit of an eccentric, who was involved in shipping. And that shipping, because the company of D-Land had developed ports on a lengthy coastline, shipping was obviously a big part of the industry of this company historically, and thus tea was kind of almost inevitable. But he was a bit of an expert, and he could taste the difference between tea leaves from different regions, and he became increasingly interested in the tea trade as he saw the popularity of tea drinking grow. and envisioned that it could be the basis for a profitable new business venture. So this pretty much mimics a lot of the development of a lot of tea companies in the sort of early 1800s. It was kind of during the early days of the Industrial Revolution, when a lot of being a seafaring nation like Great Britain was obviously a massive advantage for imports and exports. And, that saw a lot of imports coming over from China and India, where the tea leaves are grown. And obviously the British very much liked tea. And a lot of kind of enterprising people who had the money decided to go into the tea business. And this is kind of, like I say, this is sort of mirroring what happened in the real world. So this is a fairly typical thing. But I think the key here is that it's kind of Joseph Thomas saw himself as a bit of an expert, and perhaps that has remained in the company over the years. They're more of a higher end sort of, they're all about this sort of like subtlety of the flavor and the more defined sort of flavors of the Thomas Fine tea bags rather than maybe the more popular blends. Okay, so he developed his own distinctive blend of tea and established the company in 1805. So it's a fairly old company in terms of companies nowadays, but for a tea company, as I've already said, it's sort of a reasonable kind of age. And it's been started by someone who sort of saw himself as a bit of an expert. And so the founder, he did it because of his love of tea and the fact that he saw a profitable business in it, rather than kind of inheriting some cash or, his sort of family fortune and carrying on the company business or whatever. So Thomas Fine Teas has evolved to be one of D-Land's largest tea blenders. So that's kind of in keeping with the idea of the top 5 here. So Twinings, Yorkshire Tea, Typhoo, they're one of the top blenders, even though Tetley's and PG Tips have over 50% of the market share between them. They're still up there as one of the most well-known, and they're known for the premium quality of the tea leaves that it uses. So that, okay, we sort of hinted at that. So they are a premium quality provider like Twinings are, and that tells us about a bit about their marketing approach. So that's bringing us to E1 and the sort of the 4 Ps. And so when we're talking about price and products, we know they're selling a premium quality product, and it's likely to use a kind of sort of premium pricing, so more expensive than the competitors, but they're hoping that premium quality, they've got a smaller market share but more profitable products, and they're generating better margins on that. Okay, so it's using premium or quality sort of strategy here, and it uses the distinctive taste of its blends, and that's an important part of the product. So over the years, product developments, so sort of developing their products over time, have included the introduction of the tea bag. So obviously back in olden times, as we might refer to them now, tea came as leaves, and you had your own tea strainer, and you did it that way through a tea strainer with the hot water. But tea bags was obviously a new introduction some time ago, and that became the norm. And if you sort of look at polls, something like 95-97% of tea drunk in the UK is from a tea bag. So obviously it's by far the most dominant way that tea is made in the United Kingdom, at least in the modern day. And in addition to the tea bag, they introduced new black tea blends. So there is a bit of evidence that the company have had some product development and like maybe some new innovative ideas. We don't know whether they came up with these ideas or if they were just following the trends. But obviously, as we go through, we'll establish whether this is a company that is sort of ahead of the curve and they're the ones introducing new trends, or whether they're just following the rest of the industry and market. So they claim that the company has also been at the forefront in market development. So that was product development, introducing new kinds of products. With regards of developing the market, they've encouraged the popularity of green tea and several flavored infusions, which are becoming increasingly popular. So we're saying that they're at the forefront. So they're obviously, it's an important part of the company that they're perhaps known for pushing and introducing green teas and offering green teas and sort of developing a new market for green teas and maybe herbal teas and these flavored infusions. So we get a sense again that maybe there is a bit of innovation here, that the company are forward looking and looking to develop new things and bring new things to the market and sort of making money on and being progressive and innovative. And sort of bringing that back to the exam, oftentimes you'll find that we have these companies who were once innovative and perhaps developed the sort of one of the defining products or broke into a defining market that really made them popular. But since then, they've kind of slowed down with the innovation. They've become a bit lazy and sort of business as usual. And often that leads to declining sales and decreasing market share, and the company get worse off and worse off. And then in the exam, your job is to sort of identify the fact that the company has a serious lack of innovation and compared to competitors, and they're falling behind. So if we have a company that was once innovative and important and progressive, but have perhaps not come up with any new ideas for a few years, then perhaps that will be an area for them to improve in, and that will be something to suggest in the exam where relevant. Okay, so moving on. The business is based on a single site, so there's only a single site, and that means everything is managed on site. So sometimes you'll get companies that are based on several locations, and if they have a sort of centralized warehouse or production facility, it means like the added strain of logistics, getting things out to all their different places. So this is all done on a single site, which means it's going to be sort of easier to manage, but there is obviously the downside that a single site might not be sufficient if they want to grow and increase their productive output. And this is in Hightown, a large industrial town in the north of D-Land. So I'm getting a sort of strong sense that this company has kind of got a strong relation with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and obviously it being around for 200 years, and it's in an industrial town in the north of D-Land. Plenty of places like that in the United Kingdom. You have Sheffield and Birmingham, Glasgow, Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, all these kind of places, and so it's looking like it's going to be that kind of a place, which isn't sort of essential information, but again, it's just good sort of background information to give you an idea of the culture and the history of this company. Okay, and it uses a mixture of old established tasting and blending techniques. So it's got a bit of the old and the modern processing and packing equipment to enable high volume production. So although we do have a premium and potentially a quality manufacturer, they're not sort of the luxury high end where it's sort of low volume, high prices. This is somewhere in the middle, and they're obviously still in the top sort of five. They're one of the largest tea blenders in the country, and so there's obviously high volume production at a slightly higher price than the cheapest options. Okay, and so finally we learn a bit about the sort of structure of the company. So Thomas Fine Teas is a privately owned company under the control of Joseph Thomas's descendants. So it's a family business that has been passed down through the generations. The current managing director is Fred Thomas, and he is assisted by his wife Nina, who is the product director, and their daughter Christy, who is the finance director. Okay, so this really is a family business. So privately owned still, privately owned probably by the family members, which obviously that sort of brings up questions of governance. Now, since they are a privately owned company, there aren't that many sort of governance rules that they have to comply with. Obviously there are sort of the basics, but because they're privately owned, they get a bit more freedom. But obviously the fact that we have a sort of husband and wife as managing director and product director, and their daughter Christy is the finance director, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that at all. That's fairly common in private family businesses, but it does sort of from a governance perspective, we do have to raise the question of suitable employment and whether these people have got the jobs because they really are the best person for the job, or whether because they're family members. Again, probably not a major issue, but given that we'll be examined on this and governance does come up in the syllabus in various ways, then something to keep in mind that there may be questions over this, particularly if the company are considering maybe even going public, which is not necessarily the case that they are, but obviously governance will be a big issue if they do decide to go down the sort of being a public company route. Right, so that's the introduction, and we'll just go ahead straight onto the next page, page 3. And here we're learning about your role. So this is all about what you'll be expected to do in the exam. And this is basically a sort of copy-paste paragraph. This never changes from operational case study to operational case study. I've now I've done the set of pre-seen videos for the last 6 or 7 operational case studies over the last couple of years. And this really only changes, the only thing that changes here is the name of the company. So let's go through it and I'll sort of break it down for you and tell you how reading this can give us away a lot actually of what you should expect from the exam. So first of all, you are a finance officer working in the finance department of the company Thomas Fine Tea. So that gives us a bit of an idea of the structure of the company. So more than likely, the structure is going to look something a bit like this. You've got you, the finance officer, and you'll be here at the bottom. And you're in the finance department, which is this sort of whole department sort of leg here. And the finance department, you'll more than likely have a finance manager who will be your sort of direct superior. And your finance manager may overlook a number of you. So as long as, in addition to you, a finance officer, you might work alongside maybe a couple more finance officers, and maybe you'll have a senior finance officer, and all of you report to the finance manager. And the finance manager will report to the finance director, and the finance director, as well as looking after the finance department, might overlook other things as well. Sometimes finance directors oversee sort of HR or IT as well. So we'll find out later on what's the case with that. And then the finance director will of course report to the managing director, and the managing director will of course be the head of the organization, and there'll be different departments. So there'll be sales and marketing and production, operations and things like that. So it gives you an idea of this structure, and basically you're at the very bottom of it. You're at the lowest end. You're a trainee accountant in the finance department. So you'll be sort of reporting to many other people and mostly interacting with your finance manager, potentially other finance officers, and maybe at stretch your finance director directly sort of dealing with them. Because the way that the exam works, you'll go into the exam and you're given a kind of fictional scenario where you've gone into work and you've been sent an email or given a sort of a handout or a memo from your finance manager or from some other management in the company asking you to get on with a task. That's usually how these questions are framed. So that's sort of the structure of it. And you're also told that you are primarily the main thing you're responsible for is preparing management and financial accounting information. So let's just stop there and break that down. So primarily preparing management accounting information. So we know that that's our P1. P1 is management accounting. And obviously, as part of your role as being responsible for preparing management information, you can be examined on pretty much anything in the P1 syllabus. Now, the way that this exam works is that 50% of the marks available in the operational case study, 50% of them are going to be coming from P1 topics. So 50% of your questions will be on things from the P1 syllabus. So let's just sort of recap some of the main things that are in P1. So the main areas of P1 that you can really expect to be examined on, it's quite likely that something's going to come up. Remember, this is 50%. It's going to be a costing, the different kinds of costing, standard absorption costing, activity-based costing, and relating that onto budgeting as well. So all the different kinds of budgeting and how the two sort of intertwine. And of course, you can't have P1 without looking at variance analysis and yields and all that kind of stuff. And a smaller part of P1 is looking at risk assessment and what to do about different kinds of risk. And like I say, this is going to make up 50% of the operational case study exams. And so that really is your prime responsibility, will be dealing with these kind of areas, and that's covered in your job. And you'll probably be talking to your finance manager or other finance officers about these sorts of things. Okay, but in addition to that, of course, you'll have a financial accounting information responsibility, and that, of course, is leading us towards F1. So let's do the same with F1. We'll talk about F1 and the main topics from that. So in F1, of course, the key areas are primarily financial reporting, all the different things you have to do as an accountant, financial reporting is essentially leading to the preparation of the financial statements and your debits and your credits and your different entries and making sure the books balance and all that kind of stuff. You're going to have questions about tax. That makes up a part of the syllabus. Quite a big part and an important part of the syllabus that often gets overlooked is the regulation aspect of things. So understanding the regulation of financial reporting, corporate governance and ethics and all those kind of things. And then of course there is an analysis aspect. So knowing how to sort of analyze working capital and managing your sort of working capital needs and receivables and payables, inventories and cash, all that sort of stuff. And the F1 stuff with regards to the OCS, F1 will make up 25% of the questions. So with P1 making up half of it, the quarter of it is going to be F1 and the final quarter is E1, of course. But you might be wondering where E1 comes into it. Well, look at this final line here. Although you are often asked to perform tasks that affect other areas of the business, and this is kind of the way that CIMA get out of your role. If you were in a real company and you were a finance officer, you would be doing very mundane basic jobs. Perhaps some of you are in those roles and you're not really doing a whole lot. But this, of course, is testing you on the entire first level of the F1, E1 and P1. And to do that, you kind of need to be in a scenario where you're being tested on management accounting, financial accounting, and the enterprise stuff. And the way they say that is you're often asked to perform tasks that affect other areas of the business. So although you work, if you look over here in the finance department, you are the finance officer, you report to your manager, there's a chance that you might get asked to do tasks by the head of IT or by the head of sales and marketing, who are in a completely different part of the company, but they're going to ask you to do tasks. That's the way CIMA get to examine you on these things. And that could be anything from the E1 syllabus. So perhaps it's IT or perhaps it's marketing or organizational structure, those sort of things that are covered in the E1 syllabus. And the E1 syllabus, looking at past exams, that tends to make up to 25% of the exam. So sometimes the P1 will be slightly more than 50%, F1 will be slightly more than 25%. And in those cases, E1 makes up slightly less. So it is the least important with regards to how much of the exam it takes up. But of course, with the exam, you have to be competent in all the different areas to pass. So you can't just go in overlooking E1. So we'll just quickly run through some of the key E1 topics. So the main things that come up in the exam based on E1 are things like IT, human resources and HR, managing that aspect of things. Obviously, from an operational level, you're not talking too high level with HR, but it is sort of how it impacts operational day-to-day things in the company. There's obviously the marketing element, just it's kind of general business acumen and business studies, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, and maybe organizations and organizational structure. So any of these things are examinable. So you really do need to be able to, you need to know your stuff in this exam to do well. Okay, and so the way the exam works is that for P1 questions and E1 or P1 and F1 kind of questions, you're scoring technical marks. You're looking at getting usually technical marks or business acumen marks in the competencies in the OCS. Now, if you're not familiar with that, I would advise reviewing exactly what to expect in the exams. We have a range of materials out. We have our case study sort of tuition videos that would help you to understand exactly what to expect in the exam. I suppose the main thing to take from this is that, like I say, with P1 and with F1, you're mostly being tested on things like your technical skills, your business skills, and to a lesser extent, maybe your people skills and your leadership skills. Those are all the different competencies in the exam. Whereas with E1, you're mostly focusing on your business or people or leadership. In fact, E1 questions don't really carry any technical marks. Now, you don't have to worry too much all about this if you don't want. Really, if you go in and you've studied hard and you know all the different areas of the syllabus, and you don't really have to worry about technical marks or business marks or that kind of thing. So you can do quite well without worrying too much about all this, but it's useful to have this information going into it. And essentially your role is sort of setting this up. It's sort of trying to help you understand what you can expect in the exam. Okay, so we'll leave that there. Like I say, if you want to know more about the structure of the operational case study and the exam and what the kind of things are that you're examined on, definitely check out either our study text on the operational case study exam or the tuition videos, and we go through that in a lot of detail. But this is the pre-scene analysis, so let's get back to analysing the pre-scene, and we'll move on now to the next page in this video. And this is an extract from the induction manual, and we learn a bit about the sort of the tea industry and how sort of we get the early stages of getting the tea leaves and all that kind of stuff. Right, so this bit is from the perspective of the company. It's from their induction manual, and this is probably something they give out to staff when they first start. And again, this is kind of just a front for CIMA to give you a bit of general information before they get into the specifics of the company. So the company are a tea blending business, so that's their primary function, is that they are a tea blending business. So what they'll be doing is they're buying the tea leaves that have already been sort of picked and potentially dried. And the company's speciality, as we learned and it's part of its history, is that they blend the teas based on flavor. That's the thing that they're doing. And so the main thing that they're doing, and a really important part of their business, and something they need to do well to succeed, a critical success factor potentially, is they create blends of tea leaves sourced from different regions of the world, and then they make their blends into tea bags. So let's just unpack that a little bit. So I've already established that, it's a critical success factor, the fact that they're a tea blending business. Their ability to blend tea is going to be really important to their success, and it's not so much their ability to produce tea bags efficiently, but to get nice tasting tea. And that means there's going to be sort of a design element, or an element of creating recipes and sort of having experts on board that know how to make a good quality tea based on leaves from sourced all over the world. So it's going to be really important that they have that skill and ability in the company, and they don't overlook that, to make sure that they can, retain the quality and the expected quality by now. With a company that's been around for 200 years, they'll have a certain image in the public eye, and it's going to be important that they retain that sort of skill in the design aspect of the operations. So what they do is create blends of tea sourced from different regions around the world. Now, we've already talked about, dealing with countries around the world. That opens them up to exchange risks. But in addition to that, we have to think about all the other elements that are sort of relevant when you are importing from regions of the world. So one of those is going to be any kind of taxes or tariffs or anything like that involved in importing foreign products, and what kind of government they have, and then whether they have any trade agreements, or whether DLand has any trade agreements with these kind of countries. If we take it one step further, and this is a bit speculative, so don't take it with a pinch of salt, but obviously Britain once had a massive sort of empire, and there are lots of former Commonwealth nations, and that sort of put them in a good position to trade with those nations, even now that a lot of these nations are, not their former Commonwealth and not necessarily part of the British Empire anymore, but those historic sort of trade relationships still mean that Britain have a fairly strong relationship with those different countries, and it makes trade a bit easier and potentially a bit cheaper if they can negotiate good tariffs or sort of lower taxes and sort of things like that. So that's going to be a sort of background consideration as we go through. Another thing that we need to think about here, if we're importing stuff from all over the world, is the inbound logistics, and getting, bags of tea from China or India or Sri Lanka or wherever it is to DLand. That's a serious consideration. You're going to have to have a pretty good relationship with your suppliers and a logistics network set up that enables the product to get to you at a reasonable price and on time, in order to get your product out there. So there's all these things to consider when you're importing things from all over the world. Now, obviously, in the modern world, it's made a lot easier by the world has gotten a lot smaller in a sense since the Industrial Revolution sort of 200 years ago, and that you can immediately contact a factory in sort of East China and sort of get an update on what you can expect from them, and you can track deliveries and all that kind of stuff. So it's more manageable, but it's still a consideration. Now, and there is potentially another thing here. A lot of tea, if D-land, we know that they've got well-established ports. A lot of the import will come via the sea. It's a cheaper option than many of the other ones. And, you know, this might seem silly, but there are still pirates out there, and there are the chance that, you know, your shipment of goods that you're expecting might be hijacked by pirates. I don't know how, you know, how often tea is stolen by pirates, but there's still something to consider in the risk involved there. Okay, so continuing on then, to understand the business, it's important to start at the beginning. Now, what happens before the tea leaves reach us? So this is sort of, again, sticking with supplier management potentially and what sort of tea to pick. And this really does emphasize the importance of the role of the designers or the people who make the recipes, these experts who are choosing the tea leaves. This is going to be an important part in maintaining the quality of the company's tea. So we learn as we go down that there are 4 main types of tea: green tea, black tea, oolong tea, it's pronounced oolong, and white tea. And they all come from the single plant, the single Camellia sinensis plant. So all tea comes from the same plant, not 4 distinct species of plant. And it all depends on how the tea leaves are processed. Now, since this part of the process of making tea, it falls outside of kind of the operation of the company, because they're basically importing. When it comes to buying in leaves, the company are either going to be buying in green leaves, black leaves, oolong or white tea leaves. They kind of will just be buying in the things that are most popular. So as far as I know, black tea and green tea are probably the most widely drank teas, probably throughout the world, with oolong and white tea being much less popular. And so companies like this one are probably only going to buy in different kinds of black tea leaf and green tea leaf. Now, if they had their own tea farms overseas, or if they had them in their own country, if they were able to even grow tea in their own country, then they would have better control over this, and they could potentially, it would be easier for them to perhaps produce a line of oolong teas, because they already have the tea leaves. It'd be easier for them to potentially, you know, if they had a bit of spare money, or if they wanted to see if they could, you know, do some market development and try these different kind of teas on a new market, then that would probably be easier for them to do if they had more control over that, if that was something in-house that they were doing. But as it stands, it's going to be much easier for them to just stick to the more common types of tea. And that, in fact, might be something that comes up in the exam, or it might be a sort of an opportunity for the company in the future, potentially to have their own tea plantation in their own country if it's possible, or if it doesn't have the right climate, then, you know, potentially investing in or going into business with, perhaps buying a subsidiary or an associate or something like that overseas, where they have part control over a plantation and thus have more control over the way in which the different kinds of tea are grown. That might be an option. It might not be suitable for them, because one of the things I get the impression, one of the things that this company do is they get tea leaves from all over the world. And so unless they have plantations of their own all over the world, having one plantation in, say, China is going to limit their ability to make all these different kinds of teas. Okay, so it goes on to say that tea is a bit like wine, in that the atmosphere in which it is grown determines much of the flavour and quality. So tea plants typically grow best in acidic soil and regions with heavy rainfall, around 40 inches per year, although they can be grown anywhere from sea level to altitudes as high as 1.3 miles above the sea level. So we're getting a bit of an idea of the best places for the growth of tea leaves. And generally, if we just skip on to the lower paragraph, and I'm skipping ahead a bit here, but and common knowledge tells us that China, India, Kenya and Sri Lanka are the sort of the biggest exporters of tea, because they have the right kind of climates for tea to grow. It'd be much more difficult to grow tea in, say, the UK or in Norway or in the Sahara Desert. It's just not the right conditions for it. So we are limited by climate and geography in our ability to open a tea plantation. Okay, so mass-produced tea is grown on large plantations in more than 30 countries. And we've already said the biggest producers are China, India, Kenya, and Sri Lanka. Most tea is picked by hand for better quality. So there's an important aspect, something that we sort of should certainly take note of. It's quite an old-fashioned thing. Tea has obviously been around for thousands and thousands of years. I think if you go right back, tea has been drank in China for, many hundreds of years. And so it seems like the old sort of traditional techniques of picking by hand, they are still the superior techniques. We've not yet come up with a machine approach with a machine that can pick tea and keep the quality, because they tend to be too rough and damage too many leaves. So this is again going back to our pestle, this is a sort of limitation in technological advancement. Things being picked by hand for better quality, okay, so that's good for quality, but being picked by hand, well, that's incredibly time consuming. You have to use human labor, and there's sort of more potential for mistakes there, or sort of all the things that come with having sort of human labor, manual labor rather than machine labor. And obviously we find them to be too rough. So perhaps there's room there for an innovation of a machine tea leaf picker that solves all the problems of being too rough. It's softer and it doesn't damage as many leaves, and a sort of novel new technology that can deal with that. That's obviously going to be a really big deal for the tea industry, because companies would probably quite quickly start investing in this new technology, so long as the quality was retained. And it would put a lot of tea pickers in the third world, arguably in countries like China, India, Kenya, and Sri Lanka, would put them out of work. And so that new technology, although maybe a benefit on the whole, it could bring up social and ethical questions as well, because these people have persisted as tea pickers in these countries for many years, and then suddenly the technological advancement comes along and puts them all out of work. It's a debate that has gone on for many hundreds of years, and will probably continue to do so as robots come along and steal all our jobs. So that's for sure a technological part of the pestle analysis. Tea. And also, like I said, it could lead to potentially social or ethical questions as well further on down the line. So growers keep the tea plant in the early stages of growth with constant pruning, and pick only 2 leaves and a bud from the tops of the plant. So not only is it a sort of hand picked labor intensive thing, but it's a very slow process as well by the looks of it. And so it's going to be a long process going from planting a tea plant to it actually yielding a reasonable amount of crop. So this suggests to me it's a very long-term process. Okay, so what I take from that is that it's a sort of very ancient, old-fashioned process, quite a long process, and that's an important part of it, is that it's kind of quite delicate and precise and old. But that doesn't mean that companies aren't trying to come up with more efficient ways of doing this, potentially, like I said, coming up with a machine that isn't too rough and that gets a really good yield, or a way of growing tea in a quicker way. All these are likely to be things that companies are trying to do to make the process quicker, maybe more cost effective, more efficient, and etc. Okay, so that is as much as we're going to cover in this video in terms of content, at least. I think we're best to stop it there, and we'll continue with the pre-scene in another video. But before we finish off this particular video, I would like to go through a SWOT analysis. Now, you should be familiar with a SWOT analysis, but if you aren't, if you've forgotten what it is, or if you're not familiar with it, I'll quickly run through the sort of theory and the idea of it, and then I'll get you to pause the video and do your own SWOT analysis. And then once you've done that, come back to the video, because I'll be doing one as well, and you sort of compare what you got with what I've got. Okay, so SWOT is a tool we can use to help us come up with a kind of business strategy for a company. And it's an acronym, and it stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And the idea is that you basically you analyze a company, you look for their strengths and their weaknesses, you look out sort of in their environment for opportunities and threats. And once you've come up with all those, you can kind of come up with a strategy going forward that capitalizes on strengths, tries to overcome weaknesses, that takes advantages of opportunities, and tries to mitigate threats. And the idea is that strengths and weaknesses, these are internal to the company, so the sort of intrinsic properties of the company that lead to strengths or weaknesses. And then opportunities and threats, they are external. So that means that they are things to do with the environment or the general competitive arena in which the company is operating. So things external to the company, strengths and weaknesses are internal. So go ahead now, pause the video, write down your 4 different areas of SWOT and come up with a couple of things under each heading based on the information we've looked at so far. If you've already read through the whole pre-scene, just try and focus on the first couple of pages that we've looked at in this video and see if you can come up with strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, and maybe even think of ways of sort of either overcoming those weaknesses and dealing with threats or taking advantage of opportunities and strengths. Okay, so hopefully you actually paused and did that, but if not, we'll go through what I got now and compare what you got to what I've got. So for strengths, admittedly, there wasn't a great amount of detail about the specifics of the business. We had a bit of history and where they are now, but based on that, I could come up with the fact that they're a well-established company. They've been around for 200 years, and they are one of the top tea blenders in D-land, so they probably have a significant market share, one of the main competitors. That puts them in a fairly comfortable position. In addition to that, historically there was evidence of innovation, whether that came from them or whether they were just copying other companies, but the fact that they were able to keep up with trends means they're open to doing so in order to progress and move forward. So those are potential strengths for the company. And like I say, there wasn't a lot to go on, but as we go through, we'll be able to add to these and identify more strengths of the business. Moving on to weaknesses. Now I have to admit I did struggle a bit here because there's just not that much information about the specifics of the company yet, and we can't really make too many guesses at this early stage. But one thing that did sort of stick in my mind when we looked at it, and this isn't just a weakness, it could be a strength, it could be just nothing, but the fact that we have a managing director who is sort of married to another one of the directors, and they have a daughter who's quite in a quite senior position. Now, given that it's a family business, this isn't perhaps too much of an issue, but it does limit them if ever they want to move forwards in terms of maybe becoming a public company or anything where they have to apply with sort of minimum governance regulations if they no longer want to be a private company. If they go into business with, say, an associate, or they get a subsidiary or something like that, then they may be in a position where they have to justify to potentially shareholders or other people they are doing business with that you have a wife and husband in sort of the senior management and a daughter as well. And the only thing they would have to do there is prove that they are the best people for the job. And if that's the case, it's all fine, but it is just an extra step towards sort of meeting minimum governance requirements. Moving on then to opportunities. So one thing that sort of seemed like an opportunity to me would be potential investment. There was a lot of talk of plantations and the specific regions in which you can have plantations. And I did sort of mention as we were going through it, the company, as far as we know, don't own any plantations. They import all of that in, but they might give them more control over their operations if they did either own or have partial ownership of a plantation. Now, if it's not possible to have a plantation in their own country, they could look into investing overseas, maybe going into a joint venture, or buying a subsidiary or investing in a farm overseas, and that might potentially, obviously there will be drawbacks to that, but it might give them certain benefits. There's obviously a lot to that question, but it could potentially be an opportunity for them if that was something they wanted to do. In addition to that, there might be the option to go into new products. Now, I know in the real world, new products, when you think of companies that manufacture tea, like Tetley's, PG Tips, Twinings, etc., pretty much the only thing they do is tea, and that's normally more than sufficient. And now that I think of it, you wouldn't necessarily be interested in buying, PG Tips version of coffee, because you've got expert coffee makers, and although you associate tea and coffee as two hot drinks, the sort of the way in which they're made and brewed and all that kind of stuff are completely different. So the company would have to learn a whole load of new expertise in order to know how to make good quality coffee. So maybe coffee isn't the right area, but there's different kinds of tea things they could be doing. So we don't know exactly what kinds of tea they do, but there's all the different varieties of tea, and there's all the different sort of herbal infusions and blends and all that kind of stuff. So there might be room for them to go into new products depending on what exactly it is they do. And I suppose if we were go for kind of wider diversification, they might actually go into other areas. So it's not just tea that they're making, so maybe other consumables, other drinks or foods or things like that. Again, it's early stages in the analysis so far, so we shouldn't really speculate too much. Okay, so finally, let's think about threats. So one threat we identified early and we've referred to throughout so far is this idea of exchange risk as a sort of company that deals with sort of importing goods from all over the world, dealing with all sorts of different currencies. They're obviously exposed to changes in those exchange rates, and they might potentially lose out because of the change in value of currencies rather than anything that they're doing wrong as a company, and they'll have to try and protect themselves against those risks. Another one was potentially a lack of innovation. Obviously, tea and drinking tea is quite an old, sort of well-established thing. It's not a very sort of quick, fast-paced, changing business. People are quite happy to sort of plod along and business as usual kind of thing. But that could lead to, that could be a significant threat if one company is a bit innovative and comes up with a new thing, particularly as we were talking about technology. If a company does find a way of, getting a better yield on tea crops, or it gets the machinery that isn't too rough and you still get a high quality crop from the tea leaves, then that would be, that would put that company in an advantage. And so perhaps it would put other companies like this behind, particularly if, it was too late for them to try and catch up. And that's perhaps something we could add to the opportunities list to potentially invest in or seek out, new technological advancements in tea picking and farming in general. Okay, so admittedly not a great level of depth to go into so far in our SWOT analysis, because we've only really covered a couple of pages, so there wasn't that much to look at. But it is an important thing to do, and we'll be doing SWOT analyses as we go through the different videos, and as we pick up more information, we can be more and more detailed. But I think this has been a good starting point to give us an idea, a bit of context for where the company kind of is and sort of where we stand after just the first couple of pages. Okay, so that is it for this video. So just before we finish, I'd like to take you through some of the products we offer in the entire case study course. So this is just one element of the whole course, and I'll just go through the other things that we offer here. So to start with, we have a study text that is devoted to the operational case study, and that's split into two parts. The first part is a guide to how to pass the case study exam. It's full of exam tips, exam strategy, time management, preparation and planning, how to write to the marking criteria, all those kinds of things. And then part two of that study text is a condensed version of all the relevant material of the kind of things that come up in the exam over and over. So essentially it's the most popular topics that have come up in past exams from E1, P1 and F1. And so those are the two study texts available for the operational case study course. And we also do course videos that are roughly based around that first study text. So the exam advice and the timing, the planning, all the things that go in to preparing an exam strategy. We have an entire series of videos that go through that in detail. So if you're more of a visual learner rather than a reader, you can check those out, and they'll be a great help in getting you past the exams. The pre-scene analysis is the series of 6 videos where we look through the actual pre-scene in minute detail, going through every paragraph, making notes and looking how we can use this information to better prepare for the exam when the exam comes up. Separate from that is an industry analysis, and that is a document and a video as well, so the two are in tandem, and the document is about 100 pages looking at the industry in which the company exists. So for example, if the case company is in the car and they're a car manufacturer, then the industry analysis would be an analysis of the car industry. And that's like I say, that's a large document where we break it down, and we're essentially, the point of that is we're doing the research for you to save you time and energy. And the really great thing about the industry analysis is that we include 25 industry examples at the end. So things that happened in the real industry. So the example I just used, it being the car industry. If we were doing the car industry, we'd take 25 examples from the car industry of relevant news and things that have happened to companies and to the industry and consumers or whatever it is. As when we get from those 25 examples, we write a little exam paragraph, the kind of thing that you can literally rehearse and put it in your exam if it's relevant. Examiners do like to see that you have a wider industry knowledge, and so putting in a little example like that can get you good marks. We do mock exams. For the operational case study, we write 3 mock exams, and we have a free mini mock that you can do that are based on the actual CIMA style case study. So they're computer based, they're online, and they're timed, and it's as close to the real thing as we can possibly make it. And that's a really good way to prepare you for the exam. Each time we write our questions based on the pre-scene that's just been released. And with those mock exams, you can get marking and feedback, and that's really essential for you to, if you do your mock exams, I would recommend also getting marking and feedback, because you can then see where you went wrong or what you did well, and the feedback allows you to improve on that. Really important part that a lot of students skip over, and they really struggle in the exam because they weren't prepared, they hadn't done the mock exams. We have masterclasses that run over a course of 2 separate weekends, running up to the exam, and they're a live, essentially a live online class webinar where our tutor will go through with you the kind of a revision one where we're recapping on the most important topics from the E1, P1 and F1 syllabus, and one will be sort of more exam focused. And then finally, we offer pass guarantee, which means that if you meet all the requirements, so you use all these different products that are available, and you fill in a checklist to say that you've done those, but you still don't pass your exam, you're unfortunate or whatever, then we will allow you to resit our course, to take our course again at no extra charge. That's really great for people who are perhaps taking it for the first time and they don't quite pass, but they need to take the course again. If you've gone through that scheme and you've done everything that we ask you to do, then we'll give you the course again for free. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you've learned something from going through this analysis about the company and about where they might be going in the future. And as always, thanks for watching.